Good afternoon, good morning, folks. Give us one more minute. We'll just give folks another minute to join the call, and then we'll go ahead and have our presenters get this party started.
Good afternoon, good morning, everyone, and welcome to our third Back to Basics presentation. Today our topic is a detailed damage assessment, but before we get into our presentation, let's meet our presenters. My name is Liz Mays, and I'm the volunteer partner for the Regional Response Program at National Headquarters. And joining us today is Allison Weeble, Manager of the Client Care Program Workforce Support, Alicia Guajardo, the Regional Response Program Manager. And we also have our colleagues from Disaster Assessment, Sarah Perkins, Volunteer Partner of the Situational Awareness and Decision Support at National Headquarters, as well as Carolyn Mitchell, the Manager for Situ Awareness at National Headquarters. Next, we're going to let's take a look at some housekeeping here. Okay, this is a Microsoft Live Teams meeting. It's scheduled for 90 minutes. All lines are muted and you're on listen only mode. If you do have any questions, please type them in the Q&A box and we'll take questions at the end of the presentation as time allows. Please enter your name and your region with your question. That will guarantee that you'll get an answer to it. And then finally, as Leonard mentioned, we will be recording this meeting and it will be posted on the RC Care Toolkit on the RC Care office hours page soon after the event, and we'll also include the slide deck. So just some housekeeping reminders. Excuse me, we're on the agenda. Sorry about that, Allison. Here we go. All right, let's take a look at our agenda. So we've done our welcome and introductions. Allison's going to talk to us about the Back to Basics series. We're going to talk about this session's objectives, and we're going to talk about detailed damage assessment for level 1 and 2 events, as well as our colleagues from Disaster Assessment will be talking about the detailed damage assessment for DROs. And finally, we couldn't have a presentation without resources and tools to share with you, and also some next steps, and then our Q&A period. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Allison.
Thanks, Liz. All right, so just a real quick rundown here about what the Back to Basics is, and another quick thank you for joining this session. I've pulled myself off mute this time, so we're in good shape already. So these Back to Basics sessions, as Liz mentioned, this is our third session. We've already had two. Our first one was an overview of the client care program, and then a couple of weeks ago we had a session related to our intake. And it is recorded, and the presentation and recording is shared on that RC Care Toolkit on the office hours page, so you can find those there. Shortly after this presentation, we will be sharing the damage assessment as well. So these sessions are designed to go back to those early days of client care, where we spent so much time with the field when we first rolled out the client care program and RC Care. At that time, the focus was very heavy on the system. And how do we do this? How do we do that? How does the system work? Our trainings and our communications, everything was dedicated to the system use. And unfortunately, that meant that we sacrificed the fundamentals of the client care program and what it means. So we are taking our time, taking our opportunity now to go back to the basics, and we plan on running these every 2 weeks. As I mentioned, this is our third one. To go back to the foundations, the principles of the client care program. The series, we are planning on running this through the end of the year, but as we know, things come up, things happen. So we have built in some flexibility, some fluctuation to allow for, perhaps if there's a disaster relief operation that we need to respond to, or we just have to move things around for other priorities. So again, we are planning these every 2 weeks, but do have that built-in flexibility for these office hours. Okay. We plan on socializing these upcoming sessions through our cross connections, through Yammer, through all of our channels to get to all of you folks, and plan to do some direct messaging. We've reached out to recovery leads and all of that, depending on topics. So you should see multiple ways to get into these sessions. All right. So other things, we've got some of these topics as you see. We plan on talking about some referrals, some support functions, from document review to the case administrator and some of those other support functions. How to get help. User roles, another one of our favorite topics, who can do what, things like that. So we've got a lot of upcoming things, individual disaster care, and we will be announcing those as we go. We've got July coming up, and you'll see at the end of the presentation what's coming next. Spoiler alert, it's referrals. So that is what this Back to Basics series is, really getting back to the basics, to the foundations of our client care program. So why now? Why are we doing Back to Basics now? Well, we continue to operate in this environment, this agile environment, where we implement things and then we learn, and then we implement again and we learn some more, and we keep going back to make changes. So it's just kind of an opportune time. It's been 1.5 years since we launched this program, and a bit has changed. So we're trying to take this opportunity to share with you all of the latest and greatest information. We know that we are in this period where posted doctrine doesn't quite match the functionality, and the program changes aren't updated in the doctrine or updated anywhere. There's a lag in this information. So we wanted to take the time now to go back. We've learned a lot since the launch, and we've also made a number of changes, as I've mentioned. So we continue to evolve and change as we review the feedback, the lessons learned, other avenues of all of the information and best practices that you all have helped find and share, and allowed us to perfect along the way. So for that, we thank you. As we change our program and system, you all have had a hand in making this better, all of it better. So again, thanks for all of that. We are working on a number of things. One of the most exciting projects that we'll get some more information to you in. It'll allow us to get more information to you more efficiently, is this knowledge-based article and job tool perfection. Essentially taking our job tools, pulling out the system pieces and putting them, shockingly, directly into the system that you all are using. So you can have that helpful tip right at your fingertips. You don't have to go to the exchange. You can go right into RC Care. You'll be in RC Care, and you can go to the knowledge base article tab and find some helpful tips and things that you might need right there. No more tabs and things like that. So that's one of our more exciting projects that's coming down the pike. We are planning on leveraging this knowledge base while DCS evaluates all of our overarching training and doctrine. So we are very excited about that effort. And this is another reason we wanted to take the opportunity to do these Back to Basics. We've got a lot of information out there from older systems, older programs, some from way earlier iterations, and we wanted to put all of that to rest. We want to make sure that our responders have the latest and greatest. So with that, I am going to pass this to Alicia.
Yes, good morning, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you as well for joining our session today. As you've heard, the session that we have today focused on detailed damage assessment is not focusing so much on the how to do it. It's not a training, but it's more of a, think of it more of as a review or a refresher for both our DAT responders that are out there doing the assessments for our level 1 and 2 responses, as well as our disaster assessment workers who are gapped and trained to do that assessment for larger operations. So our session today, we hope to provide you with just an overarching review of the detailed damage assessment for all levels of disaster. We intend to highlight some of the key differences between detailed damage assessment for DAT, that level 1, 2 response, as well as our detailed damage assessment for larger disasters. We're going to explain briefly about the transition between a DAT response and when it might turn into a larger disaster with respect to the assessment. And we'll spend a few minutes reinforcing when to use the different assessment classifications, in particular that uninhabitable assessment. So again, not a training, not a deep dive, but more of a refresher review for all of you as we go. So we're going to start out with our detailed damage assessment for level 1, 2 DAT responses. We can go ahead and go forward. And on to the next slide. So why, again, did we move for DAT? Why did the Red Cross decide to shift from using that livable, not livable, to using standard damage classifications for DAT responses? Well, in a nutshell, utilizing one set of damage classifications for all levels of disaster, from our level 1, 2, all the way to our level 7 operations, in fact, helps the Red Cross ensure consistency in our service delivery to clients. The better, more accurate detail we can provide on a client's situation, including the damage to their home, can assist us in guiding them to appropriate resources and referrals and ensuring that they're on a path to recovery. Excuse me, in situations like apartment complex fires, where the event may need to scale up its resources, this can be particularly helpful to ensure a smooth transition. And as I mentioned, we'll talk a bit more about that later in the presentation. Should the situation be elevated to a level 3 response, DA would become the primary responding unit, and the DAT information would be incorporated into the data collected for assistance eligibility determinations. Because the data collected is standardized, the integrity of the data is ensured because we are all using the same standards and descriptions for damage determination. So really, in summary, the detailed damage assessment helps our disaster action teams to provide a quick way to communicate the variance of needs of clients when the primary focus is getting them to safe and sanitary conditions. And this information will help the caseworker during follow-up and recovery planning, for example, as well as other supports, including our disaster health services, our disaster mental health, and disaster spiritual care. The focus on fires is another reason we shifted to using classifications for our level 1 and 2. And what I mean by that is the alignment with the Red Cross FEMA Pocket Guide was really the starting point for developing and adapting the DDA for DAT. It was important to look at what is the same as well as what is different. So for example, the majority of DAT responses involve home fires. So it was important to adapt the guidance that existed to address the structural and other damage that results from home fires. Also, the importance of making accurate assessment and why it matters to our clients. So this really is a bit more about the why, and through a couple of examples. Destroyed classification would tell us immediately that the client no longer has a place to live, has extensive loss, which may include family and or pets, not just items in the home. So by asking if any essential living space was impacted and which areas, we can know better what they lost and what might need to be replaced. Let's say it's major classification. That could also drive questions like, how long will the client be out of their home? Or will they relocate or rebuild, perhaps? So if the damage is classified as minor and affected, as you know, we are still able to offer resources and referrals. And regardless of the extent of damage, just a reminder that all of our individual disaster care services, meaning specifically our disaster health services, disaster mental health, disaster spiritual care, can and should be offered to the client. And then finally, what DAT responders need to complete a DDA. The detailed damage assessment and the accompanying notes that the DAT responder is asked to add during the intake process helps with the client's situational assessment. And so keep in mind that it's really important to add details into the add notes and case comment section while you're doing intake. That will greatly assist the caseworkers and other workers that are involved with the client after that initial response. As you know, there is a course that's dedicated specifically to detailed damage assessment for DAT, as well as some job tools and some short videos. So those resources really are available to help orient Red Cross workers, and particularly our DAT responders and our duty officers, to the shift that we made in how we assess damage. Let's go on to the next slide, please. So there are 6 damage classifications used for the level 1-2 DAT responses: destroyed, major, uninhabitable, minor, affected, and no visible damage. So this is really, if you're thinking about eligibility for financial assistance, we look at the destroyed, major, or uninhabitable. The applications that have those 3 classifications are eligible for financial assistance and referrals as well to our IDC colleagues, as well as other agencies that might be indicated on the application. If the damage is minor, affected, or there's no visible damage found, the intake application will show that, and that means that in terms of financial assistance, they are not eligible, but of course, we would certainly be able to complete the application with the client, as they would be eligible for those referrals and recovery planning services, as well as the other IDC related services that we mentioned. Just remember, if there's no damage assessment, if there's no damage assessment information recorded during intake, then that is part of what helps us to determine the program eligibility, and particularly for financial assistance. So that's really important that we capture that information. Next slide, please. So this is part of the job tool, the DDA for DAT responses. And I know it's too small to read, and that's not the intent here, but just to highlight, again, some examples of some of the key updates that were made last year to the guidance around major DDA classification. This may have been a shift for those of you who are used to doing disaster assessment on larger disaster relief operations. But basically, in the beginning, we were seeing that uninhabitable was being used quite a bit. So we dug a little bit deeper and got lots of feedback from the field to make some adjustments. So we're really just highlighting here what some of those adjustments were. The major classification should be assigned for damage that can generally be described as significant damage that requires extensive repairs. Specifically, what this means is that a major classification can be triggered by any one of these kind of highlighted areas that we're showing on the slide. For example, if the fire damage is to a wall, a roof, or a ceiling system in an essential living space, and it's impacted by the ceilings pulled down or collapsed, or the walls burned and or they're not intact, that would be an example of significant damage that requires extensive repairs. Another example could be that the significant damage resulted from firefighting water, or the overhaul, which is essentially the destruction that the firefighters had to the destruction they had to make to ensure that the fire is out. So again, those are just a couple of examples of some ways that we adjusted the job tool that exists now for the DAT responders and the duty officers as well. The next slide, please. On this one, just to point out a few things related to uninhabitable. So while the criteria of uninhabitable hasn't changed, some questions were added last year as well when we made the update that you can use to make it easier to determine an uninhabitable detailed damage assessment. Here on this slide, we're showing just again some key triggers for uninhabitable. Remember that when you make an uninhabitable DDA assessment, it should ideally have input from emergency officials, and there is also the 48-hour time frame for residents being able to safely return home. That is an important factor. So for larger events like apartment fires, the decision to designate several units as uninhabitable should be escalated to the regional disaster officer before you begin any kind of you move further with the process with the clients. So just to give an example of that, a multifamily fire with only a few units damaged and classified as destroyed or major, but perhaps the utilities were pulled for the entire building, that could result in uninhabitable being used for the remaining units. Again, this decision should not be made, or should be made rather, with input from the emergency officials and approved by the regional disaster officer. It is important to conduct the DDA for all units and ensure that the correct classification is assigned. This information, as I mentioned earlier, is really important for follow-up casework and recovery, as the needs will be different for clients depending on the damage they sustain to their residents. Next slide. Just a bit more about the uninhabitable classification. The most common trigger for uninhabitable detailed damage assessment is when utilities are being pulled and the clients are not anticipated to be back in their homes within 48 hours. So that's rendering a home unsafe to live in. The ability to return home safely within 48 hours is a key trigger for uninhabitable. So again, this is why it's so important to have the input of those officials when making this determination as much as possible. They often have the most objective perspective on the situation and can assess safety conditions and timeframes for a return home for the clients. In addition to safety, accessibility of a home is also really important and can be a trigger for uninhabitable. So if a home is condemned or otherwise inaccessible because of disaster-caused conditions or damage to infrastructure, it can be deemed uninhabitable. When dealing with a multifamily fire, you very well could have several units deemed uninhabitable after conferring with the officials and your RDO. So again, just remember, in these types of situations, it would not be a blanket uninhabitable for the entire complex. And finally, if you're dealing with an incident that has the potential for sheltering or entering perhaps into a level 2 in size, you'll want to hold off on opening cases and completing detailed damage assessment until specific guidance is given from your regional leadership on how to proceed. We don't typically want to open cases and assign minor and affected classifications just to get clients documented in RC Care. So keep that in mind as well. Next slide. Here we've given in the next couple slides just some what we're calling some terms or lingo that that's helpful to know. I won't go through all of these. It's again in the job tools that you have, but just to kind of know that when we're talking about home fires, we're typically talking about structural damage, is like damage to rafters or some structural elements of the walls or the framing. It can also, of course, be caused by high winds or falling trees. This is the same as when evaluating damage on a disaster relief operation. Just remember that, as we discussed earlier, the major classification can now be triggered by the fire damage that isn't necessarily defined as structural. The essential living space, this really is a good one to just memorize. Those spaces within a home that serve the function of a bedroom, a bathroom, a kitchen, and/or a living room that is regularly occupied or used by one or more members of the household, and it requires repair to bring its functionality back to the home. So those are things that are just really important and are, again, worth perhaps just committing to memory. Finally, just a note about documenting the detailed damage assessment in RC Care. I mentioned earlier, it's really important that regardless of the level of damage during intake, to please add some commentary into the add notes section when you're doing that input. It could be the information that was provided from that emergency official. For example, it could be information that you did as you did the drive-by, or as you were on scene. Whatever that might be, it's important, again, to document so we don't have just the classification, but a little bit more detail to describe that. Next slide. One of the things as we were working on that we learned when talking to emergency officials, that there were certain terms that might be important for our workers to know that really are a little bit different than what we know or understand. And so we wanted to share some of those with you. First off is the overhaul or salvage. They make reference to that. It typically means that there's been some destruction by the fire department to ensure that the fire is out. This often means that ceilings have been pulled down, perhaps, or the walls have been opened up to look for spreading fire. We'll look at a picture in just a second of an example of an overhaul. If the roof was vented, that means that they've actually opened up the roof deliberately, putting a large hole in the roof in order to help with fire suppression. So again, you'll want to it's just helpful to understand if this impacted the roof over an essential living space. If so, you may have the major DDA on your hands in terms of the classification. Another common action is to pull the utilities. This means that electric or gas service was terminated to the home. If this was done because of a fire, then you'll want to understand how long it's likely to be before those services can be restored. A home without utilities for longer than 48 hours can be deemed unsafe and meet that uninhabitable criteria. And finally, often fire departments will also refer to fire damage and loss as confined or unconfined. And basically what this means is that confined fire generally means that it was small or a low loss fire in terms of kind of dollars. But keep in mind, again, a confined fire could result in major damage if it's over or involving an essential living space. Unconfined fires tend to spread, causing significant damage and are typically a much higher loss in terms of when we're speaking dollar loss. So again, just a few things for you to learn and kind of have in your pocket to keep in mind when you're talking to those officials. The next slide, please. And then finally, here, just an example of an overhaul that I spoke to from a confined fire. It wasn't as easy in this example to see the damage from outside. So again, a very good example of when you're going to really want to rely on those officials to help get information on the level of damage here. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and turn it back or turn it over to Liz, and she's going to take it from here.
Thank you, Alicia. So we're back to in-person responses, and in-person responses are the preferred and primary method for our responses, and also the best client experience, right? But we understand that on occasion there may be a time when a virtual response may be appropriate. And some of those reasons may be safety of our responders, safety of the clients. There could be weather conditions that prevent us to responding in person. There also may be conditions that if we can't respond in a timely manner, it's not in the best interest of our client, and the virtual may be the appropriate way to go. So having said that, it's important to understand the logical order of options to gather information that helps complete that DDA, the detailed damage assessment. And on the screen, we've ordered these options based on feedback from the field and the realities of what we found out from virtual responses. You'll find the table at the top of page 2 of the detailed damage assessment information job tool. So let's just take a look at some of these. Again, the best method for gathering fire damage on a virtual response is information that the duty officer can get from an emergency official, and they will record that in RC Care. So the next option is for that DAT responder to speak with an emergency official over the phone. This assumes, of course, that contact information for an emergency official with knowledge of the scene is available. Sometimes a duty officer will be able to obtain contact information for an emergency official, but not speak with them right away. If you're a DAT responder assigned to an event that doesn't yet have the detailed damage assessment completed by the duty officer, but you've been provided that contact information, give that person, that contact, a call to see if you can get this damage information. And finally, in the virtual response context, the next best options are direct observation of the damage by DAT responders, video chatting with the client, or doing a drive-by the scene. In either case, it's important to remember the safety of our workforce and our clients. If a client is able to video chat with you, it's recommended that you have them show you the damage at a safe distance from the home. Even if they're able to get inside the home, we still don't want them to go in, and it may not be safe for them to do so. So we shouldn't risk their safety in trying to get a detailed damage assessments. And DAT responders can do a drive-by of the home to try and observe damage from their car. If the damage isn't visible from the street, you may want to go through the backside, or you may try to observe it from another street that provides that visibility that you need. So capturing the detailed damage assessment not only outlines the order of options you can use virtually to complete the detailed damage assessment, it also includes the specific questions you can ask to efficiently gather information when you're communicating with busy emergency officials. And we're going to take a look at those next slide, please. So these are some of the questions that are outlined on page 2 of capturing detailed damage assessment information for virtual DAT responses. And they can be used whether you're speaking with an emergency official or directly observing that damage, right? So the first and most common question is there significant structural damage? If you get yes to this question, you've got a destroyed or major detailed damage assessment on your hands and simply need to hone in on which one that would be. Follow up with the question of whether the home is a total loss. If yes, then you've got destroyed. If no, you've likely got major. In either case, you probably heard some details about the damage in your conversation so far. document those details as they're what's needed to become part of the detailed damage assessment notes that we put in RC Care to justify that classification. If you get to a no to the question about there being structural damage, inquire about overhaul and fire damage to electric or gas utility systems. You might be able to classify the damage as major because of any substantial damage to these. If there are simply no triggers for major, then you have minor or affected detailed damage assessment. You should immediately move to inquiring about the criteria for uninhabitable by understanding whether clients can safely return to that home within 48 hours. Ask directly and specifically if it's safe for residents to return home within 48 hours. If not, then you need to understand why. Follow up by asking for the reason, what needs to happen before they can return, and an expected return date. Next slide, please. So this is just a screenshot from the detailed damage assessment for DAT response operations job tools. On the last page, you're going to find excerpts from the DAT Regional Response Operation Profiles Decision-Making Authorities job tool, which helps us understand how to approach some of those non-standard incidents that are outside of our typical scope, right? Which is typically a multifamily fire or small flooding. So these are some of the scenarios you may come across that don't fall in within that bucket. So I'm not going to go through all these. It's important to understand that that's there for you to help you make that decision when you're not sure whether or not we should respond. As you can see, we have listed their scenarios and what the appropriate response might be. So, for example, smoke damage to the client house, and they have health concerns. Well, disaster health services may be able to provide some assistance with that. And if a client may be experiencing extreme anxiety over a case that may not fall within that major, destroyed, or uninhabitable, but we can also offer disaster mental health services or disaster spiritual care. So these are just some of the scenarios you may be faced with and what the potential response would be. And again, if there's any questions about that, if you have regional leadership on call, I would contact them and run it by if you need assistance. And typically your DAT duty officer will do that before dispatching the disaster action team. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to my disaster assessment colleagues. Thank you.
Hey, Liz, thanks so much. So sometimes we have events that grow a little bit beyond level 1 and level 2 with our DAT response. And so we can talk a little bit about how things transition and then what we do with the detailed damage assessment when it does. So next slide, please. So sometimes, right, our duty officer reaches out to our DAT responders and sends DAT responders to the scene and says, I'm not sure exactly what's going on, but it can't be good, but let's go get some eyes on it. And our DAT responders get there, right, and they realize that perhaps this event is a lot larger than what they originally anticipated. And so as we know, right, some events can change from the initial call to Red Cross and to our duty officers, how that gets dispatched. And things will grow and change in sometimes their scope and even the type of event that we'll be dealing with. And that's going to be a trigger sometimes for the transition from a DAT response to a DRO response, a DRO being a disaster relief operation. And sometimes it's hard to tell if that's starting to make that transition, and other times, right, we recognize that size of that event is much larger than a typical DAT response. Some of the other ways we'll see that transition and a trigger for us to move from a DAT response with DAT damage assessment, right, to a DRO is when a level 2 that we are conducting has a DRO structure that has been placed into it. When we talk about a DRO structure, right, a disaster relief operations structure, what we mean is that we've put into those positions in place that really start to make it look more like a DRO. So perhaps we have mass care going on. We've brought in logistics. We've brought in our IDC teams or an ICC team, right? We've created a shelter manager position or an operations manager position or an external relations position. All of those look a lot more like a disaster relief operation than they would a typical DAT response. And when we start to do that, it might be time to start considering if we're going to be doing detailed damage assessment from the DAT job tool, or we're going to be doing detailed damage assessment that looks more like what happens on a DRO. Another trigger here is that the response is estimated to cost more than $10,000, and it's not a multifamily fire. And some of the possibilities that could be put here might be like a building explosion, right? Something that's storm related, a flood, perhaps, maybe even a transportation incident that is going to go beyond that $10,000, and it's not a multifamily fire. That too would trigger that DRO and detailed damage assessment. Okay, or the last one here is that the event has been elevated to a level 3 already, at which point it must transition from that DAT response and from DAT's detailed damage assessment to a disaster relief operation. And then at that time, it does follow all the doctrine, standards, and procedures for a DRO. Next slide, please. Right, so if the event has become a DRO, right, with detailed damage assessment, what do we do? And so at that time, detailed damage assessment is conducted by those that are trained in the application of Survey 123 and how to conduct detailed damage assessment for a DRO, which means that they're referring to categories and descriptions that are part of the FEMA damage assessment pocket guide. And so one of the key differences that you're going to see here and that we're going to talk about in a few moments is that there is no category of uninhabitable per se in that, right? The categories just change slightly. The other thing that happens when we move to a DRO and we start to do mass care and we move to detailed damage assessment from a DRO perspective, from that DAT perspective, is that we're not issuing that immediate financial assistance to our clients. And we won't do that until 85% of the detailed damage assessment is complete for the particular event. And the last thing here is that when we do DRO with detailed damage assessment, there are very specific duties and functions that are assigned for a DRO, right? And the people that have been assigned those tasks will be conducting those tasks, and that also includes doing the damage assessment portion. And next slide, please. So the last one here that I'll be talking about is the difference between DAT DDA and the DRO DDA. Right? And of course, we have to have all the same acronyms, which makes it a little bit more difficult. But the big thing here is uninhabitable, which is not included in that DA pocket guide for a DRO's detailed disaster assessment. There are extremely rare cases where uninhabitable could potentially be assigned, but that goes through a really long list of approval processes, and that would include being approved by both the DDE, so the divisional executive, as well as the SADS unit, and it's reserved for some really unique circumstances that would have that happen there. The DAT DDA job tool defines when immediate financial assistance is provided to a client, and we saw that in a few slides ago. And so the big thing here is that uninhabitable is a category, right? And so destroyed, major, uninhabitable is that immediate financial assistance that we provide a client in those categories. The DA Pocket Guide does not define or instruct on when to provide immediate financial assistance. And so once we move to that DRO and we're following the detailed damage assessment as part of the pocket guide, then there are no monetary kind of categories that match up, right? We are purely doing an independent damage assessment of property. And the last thing that we want to make sure everybody knows is that many regions do have a DA lead, or somebody who has worked their way through a GAP process, or who has studied, if you will, the pocket guide, DA pocket guide classifications, and might be considered kind of the local leader in this. And so if in fact it starts to move from DAT to a DRO and you're not sure how to kind of start to deal with that, besides the lots of leadership that you can get at the regional level, right, you'll want to make sure that you do conduct that DA regional lead or somebody else who can provide that technical consultation for you, so that you can make sure that our clients or our potential clients' damage assessment is being conducted in the best way that we possibly can do that. Liz, back to you.
Thank you, Caroline. Very interesting. Appreciate it. Let's go to the next slide. We're going to talk about some of the resources we have, and we're happy to provide this when we provide the deck. But there's a few resources that have been updated and are posted to the RC Care Toolkit under the DAT section. And they include the, you can see them listed here. I'm not going to read them all the way through. I'll just point out the in-person/virtual DAT response tactics job tool was known in the past as the COVID-19 virtual DAT response tactics job tool. So it now covers, and we've rolled in a lot of information we've learned into that job tool. And that's where you'll find a lot of tactics around that virtual response if that becomes necessary. And then again, there is a web-based training for detailed disaster assessment, damage assessment for DAT response. So in today's session, we're not going to show how to enter DDA because this information can be found in the detailed damage assessment for DAT training, videos, and the in-person virtual response tool that I cited before, again, which are all posted on the RC Care Toolkit. And while not listed here, you can also find on the RC Care Toolkit, there's a detailed damage assessment for home fires briefing for external partners. That was rolled out when we switched from livable to unlivable to help our partners understand the change to these new classifications. We've also got the Red Cross damage assessment guidelines for home fires. And this can be personalized and shared with local fire departments. And then again, there's a letter you can share, a template letter that you can share with fire departments. So I finally would like to point out the two resources from disaster assessment, the DA Pocket Guide, and also the DA Pocket Guide in Spanish. For those of you that cross lines and may do both activities, respond as a DAT responder and also work disaster assessment, you will be familiar with this guide. So we just want to make sure you had these additional disaster assessment resources. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Allison.
So after all of this wonderful information, what are some of the next steps? What's coming up? So I mentioned at the top of this presentation that we are doing these back to basics sessions every 2 weeks, building in a little bit of flexibility for the unknown disasters and then any other priorities that might be coming our way. But July 14th, Thursday, July 14th, we shall meet again, and during that time we will be talking about referrals. So that is our next topic. We will announce this next week with a link to join, very similar to this session, and then some other upcoming topics that we've got. Like we're already doing referrals. We have follow-up and recovery services that'll be coming up. And then also a session around how to get help, how to escalate cases, how to work with supervisors, that type of conversation. We've also mentioned a number of times that access to these office hour sessions can be found on the RC Care Toolkit in the little header of the RC Care office hours. We've got all of our previous sessions where you can find the recordings and the presentations. This session, this disaster assessment session, detailed damage assessment session, wow, say that 5 times fast, will be put up in the coming days. Again, also with the recording of this presentation and then the slide deck. So we've got all of that wonderful content coming. At this point, we're about 50 minutes in. I have not been paying attention, so we will be answering some questions. As a reminder, we are using the Q&A function. Please go ahead and type in your question with your name and your region. And I, at this point, will go ahead and ask Leonard if we have any questions that we want to discuss.
Yeah, thanks, Allison. Hey, good afternoon, everybody. We do have some questions, lots of great questions that we can run through. We've got a few, and I think we'll bounce around a little bit, but we'll start with Jim Court out of Cascade Region. Asked if we'll be given training record credit for this training in our volunteer records. Jim wasn't able to sign in for this training. So just throw it out there. Is this considered credit for the training, or will they have to go back and actually do the DA training?
I can take that one, Leonard. Yes, the detailed damage assessment training is required. This is not a sanctioned course for credit hours. However, you can enter your volunteer hours for the time you spent listening or watching the video or attending this meeting.
Great. Thanks, Liz. And then Nick, I think it's Beiser. Apologies if I mispronounced the last name. Nick asks, is a client required to have a related medical condition to classify as uninhabitable due to heavy smoke, odor, or soot conditions in a home? And can you talk a little more about what to do for heavy smoke, odor, or soot in the home?
Leonard, could you repeat the first part of the question? Sorry, I'm not seeing it in my Q&A right at the moment.
Yeah, no worries. Is a client required to, make sure I'm tracking on the right one. Is a client required to have a related medical condition to classify as uninhabitable due to heavy smoke, odor, or soot conditions in a home?
I'm not aware of any requirement to, I think it really is based on the assessment that our trained, and professionals, whether it's health, well, in this case, it'd probably be disaster health services, through their assessment of what the needs are of the client, but it's not a requirement that's tied to the damage classification. And then I think there was a second part.
Yeah, just can you talk a little more about what to do for heavy smoke, odor, or soot? And I'm not sure if that's like what to tell the client or if that's like how do you classify it. I don't know how to tell the difference in the question in chat.
Yeah, perhaps they could clarify in the chat and then we can make sure we answer it accurately.
All right, so Monty Moore from Indiana asks, and I think, Allison, if we could go back to the slide with like the 4 different methods of DAT DA. Monty asks if for the in-person response, are these ordered in the preference or is it like a preference of 4, 3, 1, and 2? Yeah, that one. Is the 1, 2, 3, 4, is that the order of preference, or should it be reordered, or are these just the 4 different ways to do it in no particular order?
Well, first, these are for a virtual response. So an in-person response would be on the ground making those. So Alicia, I'm not sure if there are any particular order. They're all acceptable ways to confirm the detailed damage assessment during a virtual response.
Yeah, the numbers may be confusing it, so it's not the 1, 2, 3, 4 does not list the preference. Again, as Liz said, they're all acceptable methods for virtual responses.
Cool. And then staying on this same theme and thread, Monty comes back with another question. What about news reports for DDA? Oftentimes the reports include video or still shots of fire damage. Can we use those media reports to classify DDA?
Typically, that's done in the case if there's only one responder, perhaps, or someone else is doing an independent confirmation of it. I'm not sure. Again, for if it's a virtual response, these are the 4 acceptable ways to confirm the damage, right? And then for an in-person response, they're similar, but no, we typically don't. That would be on a back end, perhaps. It might be a way to confirm the damage. Alicia, I don't know if you have any more about that.
There would need to be, yeah, we would need to have more than that. So it may be more as kind of the backup of confirming, but that would not be kind of the primary method for receiving the damage information, to confirm the damage. So yeah, we could go, if there's still a question about that, we could take that one offline to discuss more if you need to on that one.
Great, thanks. So free to ask us. Unfortunately, in the beginning, and when RC Care, it still emphasizes not needing to add a narrative, this causes a great deal of issue when supervisors ask for those notes. And I believe we had a recent enhancement that helps with that. Jamie, I believe you're back. Thoughts around the notes section or the comments field?
Yes, I am back. So yeah, we did add the situational awareness comment to the end of intake, but so people, intake workers can leave a comment there. But I also think, we do have, as Alicia or Liz, I think it was Alicia, touched on the add notes section in the actual damage classification approval that happens during intake. So there's 2 spots where you can leave those notes.
Yeah, and if I could just add there, because I think there was a sort of a question around, what should we be putting? And I think I addressed that partly when we were going through that. But just if you put yourself in the shoes of the caseworker or the health services or mental health, spiritual care worker who's going to be meeting with the client for the first time, what information that might be helpful to them, so they don't have to be repeating some of the questions that you may have already covered in your initial conversation with the client. So for example, knowing that it's major, okay, well, it's major damage, but did it destroy part of the house or damaged part of the house that needs significant repairs, and it was like the bedroom. So if you knew that it was the bedroom, then you might then know that they're likely going to need, replacement, things that you would typically have in your bedroom. But maybe it was the kitchen, it was more of a kitchen fire type thing. So again, depending on where it was, any information you would give, or maybe it was a kitchen fire, but that's where they keep all their medications. That would be something, or their eyeglasses or their dentures or something. That could be information that could very briefly be put in the add notes, or the case, or the area where you put a brief case comment to let the caseworker or the IDC worker know, so that then they can just say, I see that, you lost your cane or you lost your dentures in the fire, because they were in the kitchen. So they can kind of pick up on the conversation that the DAT responder was having. So again, I know a lot of people say or at least the comment shows that, or mentioned that it's often left blank, but just again, keep in mind as you're working with a team of supporting that client from the initial assistance through the follow-up as they recover, what information could be helpful to those other workers to best help the client so they're not having to repeat or have to dig unnecessarily in for information.
Yeah, that's good. Thanks. And yeah, I think that does circle back and address some of I think Marla's earlier questions. So thanks, Alicia. So Vince Hand joins us with a question. Good to hear from you, Vince. Can non-fire damage lead to uninhabitable? Example, tree causes utility damage. In the slides, it indicates that utilities pulled can be major or uninhabitable. How do we decide between the difference of major uninhabitable with an example like that?
I think perhaps you would have to let's look at the definition of uninhabitable. If it's unsafe because those there's utility damages, and there's not major or destroyed structural damage, is it safe or unsafe for that client to return within the next 48 hours? And that decision may be in consultation with the emergency management officials, right? As far as major, I'm not sure. Alicia, I don't know if you have any insight on that. Major, if we look at the definition of major, there's going to be significant structural damage, right? So in that case, it's probably not going to be major unless that tree causes significant damage to the home.
Yeah, I think that makes sense, Liz.
I hope so.
Yeah. All right. You guys are doing good with your questions. Just a reminder that if you do ask a question, to put in your name and your region, that'll be helpful, just so we know who's asking the question. And so Nick asked another question. Should we take medication and medical devices that need to be replaced in that 10,000 damage assessment? And I'm wondering if that's like the $10,000 threshold for a DRO. If so, how do we estimate the cost for those? Which I can take that. I mean, I don't think it's the estimated cost of a loss. When we think about the cost of our relief operations, it's the total cost of the relief operation. So, really thinking about the number of cases we're going to open up and the amount of assistance we're going to provide, as well as all of the support around mass care and all of that. So I don't know that it's an individual cost assessment of loss. It's really about the amount of assistance we're going to provide to get us to that $10,000 limit. But I will also defer others to add any more context around that if I've missed anything. All right, Marla asked the FEMA guide, the FEMA handbook is a flood tool. It doesn't do the tornado or wind damage. Do we have resources for that, or is FEMA really just a flood tool? What do we use for some of the, what's an alternative for like tornado and wind damage?
This is Sarah Perkins. If I understand Marla's question correctly, the pocket guide that DA uses is actually the Red Cross FEMA Disaster Assessment Pocket Guide, or job tool as you know it. And it does cover all types of disasters. Flooding is the most common. So it would appear if you read the pocket guide that most of the criteria seems to address flooding, but it actually does cover every type of disaster. So it is the FEMA pocket guide because their criteria has become ours as well, so that we're unified, we're consistent. but it does cover every type of disaster, not just flooding. It's just that flooding is the most common. So it would look like most of the criteria is dedicated just to flood damage, but it covers everything. I hope that answers your question.
Yeah, that was good, Sarah. Thank you. And then Pat asks, is putting comments in RC Care that describe the reason for the DA classification part of the intake training? It would be incredibly helpful in doing recovery casework to know the rationale.
The rationale for putting that information is to understand how that classification was made, the detailed damage assessment was made, and by whom. It's particularly helpful when we use that uninhabitable category, just to ensure that we're using that category properly. So that's why we've asked that it be entered during intake. And I'll be honest, I don't remember if it's in the intake training, the web-based training, but it is in that the job tools that we cited, the resources we have, you will find how to put that in.
Great. Thanks, Liz. All right, I think we've addressed the add notes. So Marla does come back with another question about the adding notes. I think it's the same on the same thread, but as far as adding notes, it seems that the virtual is different from in-person versus duty officer. And I guess there's some confusion about when to add notes, what to add, if I'm reading the question correctly. Or is there a difference?
I'm not sure a difference between what is added in add notes or what's supposed to be added. I'm not quite sure. I'm fully following the question.
Yeah, this one's a little tough. So if people, let me say this, if people have further questions, where's the best way to go to route those questions? Alicia, where would you like people to?
Yeah, you can just reach out. Yeah, sure. Just the easiest one to remember is just the DAT mailbox. So the DAT at redcross.org, rather than trying to remember somebody's name. So yeah, you can just send it to the DAT mailbox. Any kind of follow-up question or if we need some further clarification, happy to talk to you as well if you'd like that.
Cool, thanks. Scrolling through here, I did get Nick's name right, so that's nice to hear. The situational awareness new button, sounds like there's a little bit of confusion about that. Any thoughts on how we're socializing that new button? Seems like there's some confusion, perhaps some unawareness in the field. Where can someone find out more information about this new feature?
Well, I can say that when it was announced through the release notes. So if you subscribe to the RC Care release notes, that's probably the first place you would see it. And certainly for in the case of anything related to DAT specifically, any opportunity that we have through regularly scheduled meetings, for example, that we have with regions and divisions, that we always provide updates such as that one. It is a very recent release, so it hasn't been available that long. But we're using, again, any opportunity where we have that audience of folks who are doing intake in particular to let them know that has been added as an additional place to add a comment during the intake process.
Great, thanks, Alicia. All right, so Frida did come back. I think trying to track all this. All right, Frida did come back, thinking about the circling back on the adding notes and not needing to add narratives. Frida did come back and said that she's talking about the statement that's made in videos that no narrative is needed at intake for knowing what is going on in the case, not necessarily the DA. So she's glad for the comments box added to the intake last page. So I'm glad we could help you out with that, Frida. I know there's been a lot of celebration out in the field with that new feature, and we are going to catch up with the socialization of that for everybody, so that everybody's aware of it. But we were happy to add that for the field, to be able to add those nuances and details to cases that are, that are helpful as a caseworker picks up those cases. All right, so Rachel Sullivan asks, is there a different dollar criteria for multifamily fires to transition to a DRO? I think it's another one I can take. No, our criteria for DROs is, again, the total cost of the operation, and those are set regardless of the event level. So whether it's a multifamily fire, whether it's a transportation incident or a flood event or a tornado, the dollar thresholds for DROs are set regardless of the event. Richard Cuts, California Gold Country. RC Respond allows pictures and other files to be added by DAT responders. Is there a similar feature for RC Care?
There is not. I mean, you can, let me rephrase that. There are times where you can capture a client's, a photo of a client's ID or ID or address confirming document, and you capture it within RC Care. So you're sort of the facilitator for that. It doesn't actually get stored on your phone. But that's really the only time that a caseworker should be uploading an image to the case.
Great, thanks, Jamie. So John Allen from Cascades, and John, there's never a dumb question. I certainly would have the same question. As a caseworker, I wasn't aware I could look at DDA notes. Where do I find it? That was the question. Where does one find the DDA notes as a caseworker?
I don't know, Jamie, do you know offhand, like, I'm not as in cases as much as to remember what part of the case where that is.
Yeah, I believe, and it is on the verification authentication record for the damage verification.
That's what I was thinking, yeah.
Yes.
So I would check there, John, and yeah, if not, then yeah, shoot us an email back and we can figure it out for sure.
Yeah, I was logging in to try to check right now.
Okay.
So still funneling through here. I would just ask, guys, if gang, if you have a question, please phrase it as a question. We see some comments, we see some statements, and we're really not sure what to address here. So again, as you reformat this, and again, it's really tricky to answer every one of the DA nuances that you might run across or have run across. I think we've given you some resources that you can refer to if you have particular questions, while we just wanted to provide some thoughts in the overview of the programmatic intent and some situations. We're not going to be able to answer every one of the situations or nuances, but if you do have a question, please frame it as such. It'll be easier for us to filter through and hopefully get to the root of your question. So Marla did ask another question about the notes. This apparently is this is the big topic today. Whose volunteer number do you want in the add notes point of contact? Seems to be variable.
I think typically that will be the second responder. So it can be their email address or their volunteer connection number. But the second person, it would not be the person doing intake. That first responder would be the second responder who's on the case, working on the case with them. And Jamie, correct me if I didn't get that right.
No, I believe that is correct.
Great, thank you.
And we do have work slated to update those labels for the field so that they are more clear and a little less confusing.
Cool, thanks, gang. So circling back on the FEMA DA Pocket Guide. So the FEMA DA Pocket Guide comes into play at a DRO level 3 or floods. And before that, we use the DDA. So is there a difference of when we use the DA Pocket Guide or not?
Well, this is Sarah again. I'll jump in. When it's a DAT response, you're using the DAT or job tool, excuse me. When it transitions to a DRO, then the DAT job tool is set aside and the Red Cross FEMA Pocket Guide for Disaster Assessment is used for damage criteria. That's the best answer I can give you.
Great, thanks, Sarah. All right, Vince, we're going to try to get to your heart of your question here. All right. So we need a yes, no on please clarify structural damage required for DAT major or not. So I guess the example is firefighters put a hole in the ceiling, not the roof. This would be minor on a DRO. Please clarify structural damage required for DAT, major or not.
Again, I think one of the key questions is, excuse me, for major is that there has been structural damage or other significant damage that will require extensive repairs. You know, keeping in mind, for example, essential living spaces, you know, if it happens to be, you know, the ceiling or roof over one of those essential living spaces, then that's going to, you know, become a, you know, be classified as major.
And then I think the larger question at play here, and from what I'm interpreting from the questions, is there is, I mean, is there a difference between the DA classifications for the different levels of events, right? I think that's part of the larger question. Is there a difference in what would qualify as a major for a large-scale relief operation as opposed to a DAT response?
I'm wondering, Sarah or Caroline, if you could help in
Yeah.
answering this one.
I was just about to jump in. For the most part, no, there isn't, but the cause of that structural damage would be different, obviously, because it's either caused by fire or the fire department doing their thing. But for the most part, there is alignment between the DAT major and the DA major. Of course, we have other kinds of events that would create that same level of damage, but I think for the most part, as I'm looking real quickly at the DAT job tool, there is fair alignment between structural or non-structural damage. So I think they're pretty much the same. It's just the cause makes it different. If that made any sense.
Yeah, no, I think it did, Sarah. All right, we do have a few questions again, just circling back on the question about DA photographs. Just, you know, are photographs, are pictures, are they an acceptable form of DA? Can we put them in RC care? And you know, what does that look like? So I think just out of an order of efficiency here, let's just address a few of these picture questions at once. Again, can we take pictures of DA? Does it count? And can we put it in RC care?
From a DRO perspective, I'll jump in on this one. So from a DA perspective, we do not, and from a DRO perspective, we do not accept pictures, client taken pictures or pictures in general as verification of damage. This has to do with the ability to manipulate metadata, location data. There's just not a good quality way to ensure the fidelity of the image that's been taken. So at this point in time, unless something drastically changes with the technology that we're currently using, it is not an available resource for assessing damage.
And I would just add that extends to the level 1, 2. So it's the same across the board of why a responder taking a picture or a client taking a picture would not be an acceptable way to confirm the damage.
Great. Thanks, gang. That was good. So David Priest wants to circle back to including the regional director on multifamily fires when several units have been declared without power for several days, including RDO in the process. Is there a reference for this process?
I think that the main reference is going to be, I'm trying to look here now to see where it is. The main reference is going to be for DAT is the detailed damage assessment for DAT response operations job tool is going to, again, kind of point you to that. I'm trying to see quickly here if we have it noted in another document or not. We may have to go back on that one. Trying to look now with respect to the process. But that would be the main one I would reference is the job tool, the DDA for DAT job tool.
Yeah, it sounds good. And as we get close to the bottom of the hour here, we do not have any pending new questions. I think we've addressed all of the published ones.
Leonard, I would like to point out that I did add to the published feed that yes, you can find the DDA notes in the DA verification authentication. It's currently labeled as POC notes, And like I had previously mentioned, we are working with the tech team to update the names of the POC and the POC note fields so that it is more helpful for intake workers when they're filling it out and more explanatory when we are reviewing them inside the case.
Leonard, one other thing, just to go back to the previous question, there was another job tool that was referenced during the actual presentation. It also has a very long name, but it's the Disaster Action Team Regional Response Operational Profile and Decision-Making Authority job tool. And that one also provides some guidance in terms of, who's sort of responsible or accountable for making the decisions for those for those types of responses.
Cool. Thanks, Alicia. Yeah, and then thanks, Vince, for posting the reference for the decision on uninhabitable classification. I will publish that so it's available. But yeah, it's coming out of that doctrine bulletin for DAT program procedures for RC care.
Great, thank you. I thought it was in one more place, so you beat me to it. Thank you.
All right, once again, no pending questions. I think I will turn it back over to somebody to close us out.
Well, I'll go ahead and close this out. Leonard, how about that? So again, thank you everyone for joining us today, and thank you for the great questions and the feedback you gave us today. As Leonard stated earlier, this recording will be posted on the RC Care Toolkit, and we'll be providing the slides for the presentation. I encourage you to check out the resources we discussed today for additional information. And again, DAT program related questions can be sent to dat@redcross.org. I'd also like to thank all our presenters here today that made this, I think, a valuable presentation and great information, particularly as we transition from that level 1, level 2 response, right? And it starts getting into level 3, level 4. I learned a lot from that. So with that, I thank everyone, and I hope you have a great holiday weekend, and we look forward to seeing you in a couple weeks. Thank you.